Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you happen to find yourself in the world. My name is Carmen Mazzara, and I serve as Executive Director of APSIA, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. We at APSIA are so pleased to be home to the Public and International Service Advisor Workshop, and we're looking forward to bringing you a week of trainings and information sessions as part of the PISA process and the part of the PISA introduction. For those of you who may not be familiar, PISA is a community of advisors across the United States, really looking to help instill and champion public and international service. We do a lot of content throughout the year and share lots of information every week to help make it easier for you to bring these opportunities to your students and to help build out your own understanding of public service and international affairs. I particularly want to thank the Robertson Foundation for Government that helps to make all of this programming possible. And I want to give an extra special shout out to my colleague, Balungong Chur, who definitely helps to make all of this possible by being our constituent relations coordinator. This is week 6 for her, so we're trying to be nice to her and ease her in by throwing this wonderful workshop at her. Throughout the week, we have some wonderful sessions scheduled, and I hope you'll join us for all of them, whether you've already signed up for them or not. Tomorrow, we're going to be comparing the different kinds of degrees: international affairs, public policy, public administration. On Wednesday, we'll be talking about how you can best counsel students to think about what counts, whether they're putting together a grad school application, a job application, or a fellowship application. We'll be talking about graduate school and paying for graduate school. And then on Friday, I hope you'll join my colleagues and I for a session on what APSIA and what PISA can do for you to help make life a little easier as you bring these issues to your campus. We have a great conversation today, spearheaded by my colleague Elise Goldwasser from Duke University. This session is being recorded and you'll find it on APSIA's YouTube page afterwards. If you have any technical issues throughout the session, please let my colleague Brittany or I know, and we'll be sure to take care of them. Otherwise, when you have those great questions, feel free to grill our panelists about their experiences all you like. You can put those in the chat when the time comes or throughout the session. And so with that, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to what I know is going to be a wonderful week and turn the floor over to Elise.
Thank you, Carmen. I don't know if I can really beat that. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to learn from our colleagues, and I think that y'all probably saw that we have their bios. I'm not going to go into everybody's bio, but I am going to say that we have a breadth and depth of experience here, and I hope you'll take advantage of it. First is Alexius Butler, who's a USAID, and she and I think, are a little nervous right now about a certain basketball game in a few days. And we both grew up in Atlanta. Theo Carruthers is at Booz Allen, and he's mentoring one of my former students. And I was delighted to hear that they play video games together. And Mark Ritchie, even though he lives in Minnesota, he grew up in Noonan, Georgia, where my mother's college roommate grew up. So I think I want to start with asking y'all, the three of y'all, where you looking back, what would be the first thing you would tell 18-year-old you about starting on your career path? What is, with all the fears that we have with a year of hiding in our rooms, taking classes on Zoom, and just learning how to talk to people face to face again. If you were talking to 18-year-old you, what would you want that person to know? Lexius, would you start that off, and then would y'all jump in?
Sure. Thanks so much, Elise. And good afternoon to everyone, or morning or evening, wherever you are. As Elise alluded, I was a Duke, attended Duke for undergrad, and I was a political science major there. And quite honestly, that was because I thought I was going to go to law school, right? Because that is what everyone kind of told me as the progression. And I realized that I didn't want to go to law school, but I wanted to do something to help people. And it wasn't until my senior year that I found the Sanford School. Can you believe that? And so the public policy section at Duke University. And I felt like, I had kind of been telling my advisors and the folks like what I wanted to do, and they kept shifting me back to political science. And I think that at my 18-year-old self, I would have told, to get out there a little bit more and like really figure out like where to go for those things. Because had I been a public policy major, I probably would have got into this career a lot sooner. Because what ended up happening is that, I graduated. So once I graduated, you got to get a job. And so I went into public relations. And quite honestly, that was only because at the Sanford School, they had a library, it was back when we had actual books that you had to go and find information on. You couldn't Google it, et cetera. And they had a listing of public affairs firms in Washington, D.C., because I knew D.C. is where I wanted to be. And those firms were actually public relations firms, but it was a job. And so that's where I ended up. And I didn't end up doing the international thing until maybe 10 years or so later, because it took me that much time to really be able to articulate where I wanted to go. And quite honestly, my advisors didn't know about USAID, primarily because USAID has not done a great job of educating people like yourself that we're here and what it is to be a foreign service officer or even a civil servant for us. And so, now I'm with you and you'll have that information. And so I think that you'll be able to advise your students like myself to get into the career a little bit sooner. But, there's other things like Peace Corps that I would have done, et cetera. But hopefully that answers your question.
Theo, Mark, how different was your first experience out there in the world?
Mark, do you want to start?
I'll take it from here. I was active in my church, and Sunday nights in January were called Mission Sundays, and they had speakers from around the planet. And by that time, I was in a little tiny rural town in Iowa, but it was opening into a much larger framework. And it got me asking questions. And in that moment, it made it possible for me to ask my father questions, who had been in the service in the Second World War. And so he'd been around the planet and seen a lot of things, including people dying from hunger in front of him. And so it was something in a learning process in the community that got me thinking and got me asking questions. But this was 1968, and there were many other things going on in the world, issues around war, Vietnam War, assassinations and political issues, but also the energy of the Peace Corps and some of the other things that have been part of that expression. So for me, it had to do with that moment beginning to say, how do I understand this world, or what part of this world can I be part of? I remember that I would get magazines or books or some kind of reference. There was no internet or all of that, but I would send little postcards out and say, hey, I want to know more about that. And people would send me this amazing information from, other parts of the country. And so pursuing more knowledge gave me more confidence that allowed me to then pick a path. And in the end, I actually was part of a United Methodist Church volunteer program, kind of like not an adjunct, but something alongside of what we had inside the U.S. of a Peace Corps. And my assignment was, or my responsibility was, working on a cooperative food system in Northern California, which connected me to international markets in food products. And that began my thought process about how connected we are through the planet, through that particular experience. And I've basically been active on international public service now for 50 some years.
Do you think 18-year-old you would be surprised at where you are now?
Well, when I was 18, they were trying to draft me to go to war. Mm-hmm. And so I had a lot of time to think about those things. And I was a little bit younger than my classmates. And so I was actually in college at the time. And I had a teacher who pushed thinking, say what you are thinking about that war. And so maybe an 18-year-old who was still in high school would have a different experience than an 18-year-old who was in college in 1968. But my impression from raising teenager and all that is that young people are in their own conversations very intensively at very young ages. That was different than my 18. I will say that one important thing happened was in my senior year in a class of 83 in my high school, there was a student from South Africa. And she came back to my little hometown for our 50th high school reunion. And she got up in front and she said, I want to say something to you. You know, she thought she was going to go to California, New York, but she ended up in a little town in Iowa, which is where I was. And she said, but when I went home, so 55 years ago now, she said, I, for the first time in my life, thought that perhaps someday I could live in a multicultural democracy. And she wanted to let us know that that was one of the outcomes of her being in that town in that moment in 1968, a big year in America. So it made me think differently to understand how complex the global process is and how where the least expected international experience that you might have can have a profound impact. And somebody will, on occasion, come back and tell you about that impact. And that's an energizing, affirming thing that then can be shared with the whole community.
Well, see, when you were 18 at Morehouse taking French,
whoa!
What were you thinking about an international career, or were you not?
That's a really great question. And hello, everyone. Regardless of the time zone you're calling in from, so glad to see so many people on the line. I think 18-year-old Theo had totally different priorities. And so I think if there's one thing that I would tell 18-year-old Theo, it would be, GPAs are overrated. Go talk to people. School is great. School is fun, but school comes to an end, and at the end of school, you either have a lot of debt or you have a lot of experience or you have a little bit of both. And, I had a lot of debt and I knew I wanted to make a splash in the world in some significant way. And I wanted to do it through the international studies realm, the international affairs route. But I was so engulfed and enamored with school that I didn't prioritize a lot of the professional experiences because to me, getting through school was the most important thing. And so I would go back and tell 18-year-old Theo, your GPA is overrated. The assumption is that you're smart. Get as many diverse experiences as possible. Go talk to people, go do a domestic exchange, go to DC. I had the pleasure of studying abroad while I was an undergrad and had an amazing time. And it was life-changing. But if I would have known what DC was like, as an 18-year-old, that would have been a foreign country to me as well. I grew up in, the golden state of California. And so going from California to Georgia was a bit of a culture shock. Going from, Georgia to, Switzerland for 6 months was another culture shock. So DC would have just been another amazing addition to that list. And I think even more importantly, I would tell myself, it's perfectly okay to change your mind. I was interested in so many things at the time. And I said, great, you pick something and you stick with it. I think at the time I said, I only want to focus on guns and butter, security and econ, the only things that I care about. And then you learn so much more, the more time you spend talking to people, getting these really cool experiences. And, I identify as a stark extrovert. And though I enjoy talking to people, I think 18-year-old Theo was a little more shy at the time. And so I would definitely encourage all those years ago, 18-year-old Theo to stop studying so much and get out of the classroom, leave the library, a little controversial, but go to work.
I think that your question has led me a little bit off script, and I'm wondering, how do y'all feel about having people cold email you and say, I want to do an informational interview? Somebody who just finds you on LinkedIn or, has no connection to you, but thinks you're interesting. Lexis, do you want to go first?
Sure. It just took me a second to find the mute button. I always respond. I think that particularly as a Black woman in this field, that it is my responsibility to help others who want to get into this field, because I didn't have this information when I was younger. And so every time anyone sends me a message or a request for an informational meeting, I always take the meeting. And I encourage people to do that. When I go to different events and I talk to folks, I was like, send me an email request. And unfortunately, what I find though, is a lot of people are shy and won't send the email. And it's like, and I legitimately will plan to meet with them if they contact me. But I also try to organize different events and outreach efforts so that more people can get this information about coming to work for USAID. Because quite honestly, we have been doing an excellent job of recruiting from certain schools and not from a lot of other schools where there are fantastic students who would make great officers within our agency, but we just have kind of gotten comfortable with the recruitment lines that we've been using for the majority of the time the agency has been around. And as a result of that, the majority of our Foreign Service officers look a certain way and don't necessarily represent the way that the country looks. And so we have to be proactive in doing it. So I'm always receptive to those requests.
And when people come to you for a conversation, what do you want them to have prepared before they get there so that they just don't go, hi, my name is Bill?
Yeah, well, sometimes, that's the challenge is that, again, like I said before, we as an agency don't do a very good job of explaining what we do. And so I actually am willing to walk people through the process of this is how the US government looks at international development. This is what I do as a Foreign Service officer. This is what civil service officers do, to give them that full background, because it's hard to find that information, quite honestly. And if you don't know somebody who's in the agency, your information is likely to be pretty limited. So, even if you're starting from zero. Now, I do like it when they've actually gone to the website and at least taken a look at, who it is we are. Because I've had people before be like, yes, I've always wanted to work for a nonprofit. And I was like, this is not a nonprofit. This is the US government. And so, having a little bit of information about the agency is helpful, but it's not unusual that and especially younger students who they'll likely have very little exposure to USAID. So I don't mind it at all. But I also do usually tell them to consider that meeting our first meeting. And I ask them to follow up with me. Not all of them do, but some of them do follow up and come back and, a month or so later or 6 months later. And, they want to revisit the conversation or get more information. They've had more time to think about it. And that's always welcome.
Would you elaborate on what USAID actually does and what you do as an officer?
So now you're going to put me on the spot, Elise.
Yeah, I want to hear your elevator spiel.
Okay. Well, so, all right, USAID is the US government's foreign development arm. And so we work in about 80 countries around the world with the goal of trying to improve the situation in that country so that they can either be more stable or have a better economy, but really to be a good partner with the US government. So I personally joined the agency as a democracy and governance officer. And so I was focusing on political development, looking at, where are the areas at USAID as a foreign, knowing that we are still representatives of a foreign country when we're in that country, but where can we help them to improve their systems or processes? And quite honestly, people are like, oh, you're a democracy and governance officer, but how is it you're promoting democracy there when our democracy is so flawed? And so my response is usually that we're promoting aspirational goals. Right? These are goals that these are things we want to see here, but we also want to see it in other countries. And, that includes inclusion of marginalized individuals and components that until recently, I would say, were not necessarily happening here. But luckily things are changing. And I feel like, the domestic side is catching up with the foreign policy side. And I am a Foreign Service Officer, which I've mentioned before, which means that I spend the majority of my career living and working overseas. I'm currently doing a domestic assignment, but basically when this assignment is done, I'll be expected to go back overseas to another country. In my career with the agency, I have been assigned to Afghanistan, Iraq, Bangladesh, Liberia, South Sudan, and Haiti. And so these are the kind of places that we go to as a Foreign Service Officer for USAID. Now, this is very different than a Foreign Service Officer for State Department. And I want to make sure that people get that distinction. USAID is an independent agency, and the work that we're doing is development focused. State Department is a separate agency, and they work on diplomacy overseas. And they get to go to different places like Paris and Switzerland and Canada, places that we don't go to as Foreign Service officers because those are not developing countries. We do have civil servants that work for us, which I mentioned before, and those individuals are ones who travel is not as intrinsically intertwined with their job. So while they may travel some, their jobs are based in Washington, D.C., and they tend to focus on the broader policy issues that we're implementing on the ground. So hopefully that helps. I've tried to keep it less wonky, but I find myself slipping into it sometimes. So apologies.
Thank you. I think that was very clear. I don't think I have ever been able to explain to students that succinctly. So I think I'm going to show them our clip of you doing that.
Okay.
I want to know, Thea, what was the first thing you did after grad school? No, really, right after undergrad.
Yeah.
What did you do?
Right after undergrad, so I finished a semester earlier than planned. Huge bummer, because again, I was so focused on graduating, I did not think about what happened after I graduated. But I had a chance to follow up with one of my internships, and I was working for a politician in Southern California, one of my local elected officials. I mean, which was exciting. I knew it wasn't, my end goal. I had the aspirations to be more international facing. And so I worked that job for a few months while I was applying to grad schools, got into the University of Maryland, and my mentor highly suggested that the University of Maryland was going to be my best option because he knew a couple of the professors there, and he said, these are some of the, best minds that I've ever had a chance to interact with. I think the University of Maryland would be great. And so, I took a little bit of time off from working to go visit and, see what the East Coast was like, and moved out to Maryland maybe about 5 or 6 months after graduating. So I graduated December 2015. And so June 2016. I was in the DC area, and then started grad school in the fall. 2 years later, wrapped up and, worked at the University of Maryland for about 2.5 years in career services, because I was, again, too indecisive about exactly what I wanted to do. And again, I thought that the grades were more important, even in my Master of Public Policy program. But, at that time, I got to learn a lot about the different options that were available, from a professional standpoint. And I decided that, that nexus, that middle ground between international security, well, I'll be even more specific, intelligence, the intelligence community, the international world, and government, that perfect nexus was a government contractor, in the DC area. And, that's essentially how I ended up working for Booz Allen. But right after graduation, I did all the networking that I could and ended up with one of my internship supervisors who was up for re-election, got some really good exposure to what it looked like to be an elected official in Southern California, of all places. Realized that as beautiful and as amazing as California is, I wanted something a bit far reaching that had an international flair. And so I packed my bags once again and moved across the country, and it'll be 6 years in June.
I want to follow up with that with two questions, because I see when our grad students come to the MPP program, a lot of them have no international experience, except maybe watching Argo or the movie. And they say, that inspired me. I want to work in an international field. But what do you do? How do you develop that when you're still an undergrad or a grad student? And then also, Theo, I want you to talk a little more about exactly what it is that your job is that you can tell us without shooting us.
Well, I think that the first questions are probably the more important of the two. And, I remember my first exposure to knowing that I wanted to work at that, the international facing world was my French teacher, my junior year of high school. His name is Olivier. I always called him Oliver. He was like, there's another I, monsieur. I was like, get out of here. It's so overrated. But his daughter worked for the UN. And I thought that was the most exciting thing in the world. And of course, every high school wide-eyed, uneducated kid says, I'm going to go work for the UN one day. I'm going to do all the research in the world. And so, I thought, okay, great. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to focus on international studies. And then, again, one of the professors when I got there said, you tested pretty high in your proficiency. You should think about double majoring. And I was like, no, I think just the international side. And so even having, what were strangers at the time encouraged me to say, no, you've got some talent here. Let's definitely build that out a bit more. And so I ended up deciding to double major. And she said, well, one of our requirements is you got to study abroad. And, you can pick any country as long as they're French speaking. And I was like, okay, well, everybody goes to Paris. I would love to go to Switzerland. She said, great. It's going to be expensive, but, if you've got the wherewithal to figure it out, we'll support you any way that we can. And so I did a program focused on international studies and multilateral diplomacy, international relations and multilateral diplomacy with the SIT study abroad program, and had an amazing, wonderful time. Learned a lot about the international world. We had a chance to, I think I chose that one in particular because they sent us to Paris for a week and to Brussels for a week. And I said, great, 3 French-speaking countries, 1 semester. This is probably the best it'll ever get. And being able to interact with the international organizations that we were exposed to while, in the country that is known for being the most peaceful and the most, we don't want to get involved with anything. We will be extremely neutral. To be involved in like the political world, even internationally, was an amazing experience. And that carried over, once I got back from studying abroad, I said, great, let's take some classes that I would have never thought of. And so one of those was contemporary African politics. And I said, this is incredible. Maybe Senegal is the next place that I'll go. But my professor at the time pushed me pretty hard to to really apply myself, to take it a bit further and to, Thea, you've got the talent for grad school, you've got the wherewithal, you might as well, take it to that next level. And I was like, maybe I'll go back to California. And so it was oftentimes individuals far, far more intelligent than I was saying, there's a lot of room for growth here. I'm going to encourage you to push it a little bit further, which, honestly kind of led to each next stage. And, then I eventually landed at the University of Maryland, had a chance to do an international trip there. We went to London for a week and Vienna for a week. And both of those were, that trip was awesome. It was another international organization centric opportunity. And it really kind of solidified why I wanted to work in this international facing sphere. And so as a nice lead in, what I do primarily for Booz Allen is on the research side, more so on the research side, but, they now have me in a cultural change management. So, we work with primarily, so I guess to backtrack, Booz Allen has 5 specific buckets that they align to. I'm in the consulting bucket. They also have analytics and cybersecurity, digital solutions, engineering, and I hope that's 4, because, let's just say that that's 5 total. And so I'm on the consulting side in the national security group, working specifically for 3-letter agencies. Is probably the easiest way to describe it. The senior government officials in the 3-letter agencies. And oftentimes we support, a lot of what I've done is supporting workforce transformation. The client that I support now hasn't had a day off in about 2 years. And so, being in the intelligence community, working with members of the intelligence community oftentimes means that they don't have the same flexibility to work from home. As, it's not just a matter of great, everybody can't be in the office. And so how are we going to transform our workforce? And so a lot of what I do now is working with those clients to figure out what does the future of work look like for these senior government officials who don't understand the concept of working from home. What industry best practices, what are private sector companies doing that is really innovative that government can use to innovate with? Oftentimes the running joke is that government is always playing catch up to the private sector, and one innovates and the other catches up, and then it's kind of this back and forth. And so a lot of what I do is the research to kind of help with that change management, to getting them from one side of this sounds cool to what does the implementation look like. So 90% of what I do is strategy related, research related, and more and more it's becoming a exercise in how can we get there the fastest while being as efficient as possible. And so, there's a lot of failure in this job, but it makes a lot of room for creative ideas, which honestly is probably the most exciting part about being in the consulting side. And, Booz Allen is just one of quite literally thousands of consulting firms, especially that have that government flair. And if you never want to do, or if your students have no interest in government contracting and government consulting, that is one of maybe about a dozen different options at Booz Allen Hamilton. And so if they say, I never want to get a security clearance and work with these very covert secretive agencies, they could still make amazing change, whether they're supporting a federal client, whether they're supporting a commercial client with an international mission. And so I think long story short, it depends on the month, but I do a little bit of everything from time to time.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask Mark a question, but I want y'all to think about this too. Mark, what kinds of attributes, qualities have you seen in people who are successful in the work that you've done over the past decades? And how similar and different are they between where you've been?
I think there's qualities that I look for. And so there are people who want to be thinking about international affairs, international service, whatever, because they imagine their own life involved in that, in the foreign service or something. And we've talked about that. There are others who want to be engaged in that more global community, just to be more enriched in their own life, whether their day-to-day work takes them into an international arena or whatever. And for some, it's they want that to be in their children's lives, and so they want to, whatever their job might be, 8 to 5, so to speak. They want to, make the world in the neighborhood, and this is somewhat kind of telling in a conversation. If somebody lights up, or if somebody gets really ask a lot of questions. You earlier asked about people cold calling, and I love that. And more often somebody says, is it okay if I tell so-and-so to call you because I was a former Secretary of State? And, being elected official has its other characteristic. But in any case, you do have to tell people to not be shy. So when I do get into a conversation, and it can be anywhere, literally, I can tell when they light up about their respect level, their interest level, their own understanding of their roots and all of the complexity of life. And they can sometimes set off a red flag if they have sort of a fixed opinion about some aspect of the international, because international is kind of controversial. Somebody was talking to me about war, and I serve as a civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, so I'm paying pretty close attention. But I grew up in the 60s, and the Vietnam War was a dominant question. And so we find ourselves brought into an international way of thinking or an international exploration by different paths. And if there's somebody who's had a path that was being themselves a student overseas, or in their home being a home host, a brother or sister from some other country that lived in their home, that kind of thing, I can tell very quickly will be somebody who has an interest that's actually motivated out of their own experience. If somebody mostly has it in their head, you mentioned the movie Argo. A local synagogue here brought the Argo couple, to our city, and that was exciting. But you could see in the crowd, and it was packed, there are people who that movie was an opening into thinking, but that's different than having a direct experience. I find that this moment that COVID has created a global awareness, that climate is creating a global awareness, that conflict and war, and I can go negative and say, lots of wars going on. All of a sudden we're paying attention. Or I could say, climate's been a mess, especially in the Pacific and on the North and South Pole. And, I can go on and on about, why haven't we been paying attention sooner? But the fact of the matter is that right now we have interconnected, interlocked global experiences that then lead us to perhaps a larger conversation. And so one of the things that I look for in conversations is, if somebody's passionate about climate, are they also thinking about other people's passions and where those passions might come together to say, we're all in this together, and we got to come out of it. I live in the state of Paul Wellstone, we all do better when we all do better. And then now we say, and until we all do better, we're all at risk.
And I want to follow up on that by saying, so you've talked about what people bring emotionally, but what kind of concrete skills also
I mean, they're the basics that you would call relationship building skills, because that's really what it's about. Listening, empathy, assumptions that relationships are two-way streets, speaking another language. Now, many people come pre-built with other languages because here they are. Theo took French. I had Miss Furley through third grade in suburban Maryland. And I have practiced it in occasions, but I've gotten myself in trouble, which is another side of communication. Now, you can get yourself in trouble if you're the eloquent Shakespearean on the planet. You can get yourself in trouble if somebody's asking you where so-and-so is in the airport, and you can tell they are desperate, and you're trying your best to know what that word was and what that answer is. But certainly languages rewire your brain and your heart in special sort of ways. And a little bit of effort also brings a kind of an appreciation that can smooth difficulty. I mean, my wife and I have difficulty communicating plenty of times, so it's not like it's just language, but you know what I mean? If you're trying, it makes a big difference. I have to say that the old days, let's say pre-internet for old days' sake, the sources for certain kinds of information were limited, and I would say more, always kind of more expensive. Like I worked on trade negotiations for a very long time, and there were insiders inside U.S. trade, literally, but you had to have $2,000 a year to have inside information. And so there was a way that some aspect of the international was kept secret or shrouded in mystery, might be a sweeter way to say it. And if you had a pile of money, and $2,000 used to be a lot of money, you could buy your way into feeling you were getting kind of inside information. I believe the world has changed very fundamentally in this question. But then we have the challenges of misinformation and disinformation and bullying, So we have more access now, and we need to just take responsibility for the dangers or the difficulties that come with that.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions that I'm happy for any of y'all to answer, but specifically, what do you think that advisors can be doing to help their students develop the skills, get the experiences they need, especially when we're talking about students who don't have a lot of resources and who come from schools that don't have a lot of resources?
I'll jump in. I think, because I get this question a lot, I think that one of the things I always encourage students to do is to look around your community and get engaged there. Because a lot of those issues that they're going to be addressing at the community level are issues that we're addressing overseas. And so those skills are very relevant, but people are always like, oh, I've never been overseas. You don't have to do all that. If you're a teacher at an elementary school, we still want you to come and work for USAID. If that's all you've done for the past 15 years, that's still relevant experience to what we're doing, because development is very, very broad. And for students that are in school, I tell, look at your church groups or like religious organizations that you may be affiliated with. They're likely doing some of these things already. And so get involved with that, or get involved with something on campus. The student groups that are engaged in those different activities, that's a great way to get some experience. If you're interested, like me, in politics, volunteer for political campaigns, learn how they work, learn what to do and what not to do. There's a lot of different opportunities there. I volunteered for, when I was at Duke, I volunteered for voter registration. Those things are relevant to the work that we're doing. And so just really, the way I usually phrase it is to kind of think about doing something bigger than yourself, right? So not just something that's going to help you fulfill you individually, but something that's going to improve the situation for other people. And those are the kinds of things that actually are relevant to the work that we're doing overseas.
And why should career advisors be encouraging students to go into public service and international affairs in the first place?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I think that, somebody's got to run the government. And so, we can't just have a whole bunch of old people running it, because then nothing's ever actually going to improve or change. And, we want to have new ideas and fresh ways of looking at things and addressing the challenges that we're working on, because, we know that that's the only way to improve. And that's the only way to do better, is to bring in those younger people who haven't been so mired in what we're doing and can come at it and look at it completely different way from the way we may have been viewing it. And like I said, well, actually, I haven't said this. I think that the job that I have is probably one of the best jobs in the world. And it really, I think it's, if students knew about it, they would be very interested in it, but it's just a lack of information for the most part. And quite honestly, and it pays really well, and nobody really knows that, and it's like, I've had students before. Actually, I was speaking to a class at Spelman, and they were incredibly bored by, what I was talking about, until we got to the point where they were like, well, how much money do you make? And, and as a public official, like, you can Google my salary. It's all out there. And one of the students did, and then all of a sudden everybody sat up, because it's like, okay, this is a real career. It's not just a labor of love. You actually get paid for this, and you get paid well to do this. And honestly, that's why I think it's a phenomenal job. And I think that everybody, if people knew about it, then we'd have a lot more applicants than we currently do, and a lot more diverse applicants as well.
Yeah, you're combating the impression that all the boomers have created out there.
I'm wondering, yes. I'm wondering if our audience has questions. Please put them in the chat, and I'll be happy to ask our panel for you. Speaking of salary ranges, what would you say you would expect? Like, if you're here at Booz?
Yeah, great question. So
if you come in with a BA.
Coming in with a bachelor's degree. I think there's two important pay bands. Both are pretty nice. I think coming in limited to no experience, I honestly, depending on what you're doing at Booz, you could probably come in making 60 to 80K. I'll be even more specific. If you're coming in with a clearance, that number can shoot up to about 90. You could be on the upper band of about 92 to 95. Coming out of undergrad with a top secret clearance, and these top secret clearances. One of the hidden things that I didn't think that was actually possible. There's nobody gives undergraduate students a top secret clearance, right? Duh, of course they do. And so whether you're doing your traditional internship with the Department of State, whether you're doing an internship with the FBI will give you a full clearance with the polygraph. And I'll put this in perspective. Booz Allen has a policy that if you refer somebody who has a clearance with a polygraph, you'll get $7,500 just for referring them. And so if the referral bonus is about almost $10,000, you can imagine what they're paid, yearly. And so if you come in without a clearance, I came to Booz Allen without a clearance, and, undergrads can healthily make anywhere from 60 to 80K, limited to no experience. Well, even if they have not worked a job previously, based on what they're going to support. So Booz Allen brings a lot of great things to the table from a monetary perspective, I'd say.
I muted myself so y'all didn't have to hear my dog. One last question I was thinking.
Looks like we lost Elise.
Elise, you froze.
Am I
Kick Kick your video off and say your question.
Am I back yet?
Better.
Yeah, this is one of the perks of being out in the garage. I want to go back to what Alexius was saying about
Elise, we can't hear you.
getting, how do you establish that? Yes. Shoot.
Type it in or just turn your video off, and I think you'll
Let's
have
see if that'll work.
band. Yeah.
What Alexius was saying about having people work on international issues in your own community. I know that, for instance, in the Triangle area, we have immigrants, refugees from Afghanistan and Syria. And so our Arabic-speaking students from North Carolina Central, from UNC, from Duke, do a lot of work with Church World Service. And I was thinking, those seem to me like they would give the students useful skills. And I'm wondering, what do you think, Alexius? Is that useful?
Oh, incredibly useful. I mean, that's exactly the kind of things that I think would lead to a career with USAID. And, you know, and even if it's not necessarily international, just keep in mind that, you know, those things are available. When I was at Duke, I interned at NARAL in downtown Durham. You know, so working in nonprofit sectors and looking at different issues, even if they're domestic issues, is still very relevant to the work. It's just really about how you can you utilize it going forward. And one other thing I do want to highlight, because I don't think I said this before, for you all when you're talking to your students, is to note that in order to be a Foreign Service Officer with USAID, you do have to have a master's degree. However, for our civil service side, the most of those positions don't have a degree requirement with them. So I just wanted to make sure to make that difference for everybody.
And we have one final question from our audience about, what about students who say they're too busy because they've got coursework, they're working a couple of jobs, they're sending money home to support their families? How do you encourage them to get out there and begin their journey on this kind of career trajectory? One thing I would suggest is Duke has figured out a way for some students to use their work-study funds to work at nonprofits in the community. And I know Carmen wants us to hang on to do a survey. So that was a pretty anticlimactic end, but do y'all have any other recommendations?
Well, here's a quick one. You know, there's so many podcasts and webinars on international issues that are free, that are global, that are in all languages, whatever you want to practice or whatever's natural. And you can listen to them while you're walking, which you should be doing every single day, at least for an hour or whatever is your routine. And so combining the free availability of incredible material with something in the day that is part of your routine is a inexpensive next step. You will hear somebody who will spark your heart. Call them, cold call them, cold email them. Start your path in that kind of way.
Carmen, I'm ready to turn things back over to you.
Well,
thanks, everybody. I've enjoyed getting to know you.
Thank you, Elise. Thanks to all of our speakers. And one of the loudest common threads that I heard was the power of all of our advisors in shaping everyone's trajectory and moving forward, as well as the many opportunities that are present right now in your communities for your students. So I'm going to ask you all to please complete a very brief evaluation survey. Brittany, if you'll launch that survey, that would be great. to let us know how we did and let us know how we can continue to serve you throughout this week and going forward. We very much encourage all of you to join us tomorrow where we will be unpacking some of the differences in those grad school degrees that we often hear so much about. We'll be exploring even in more depth those issues about what counts, service jobs, the jobs folks need to pay the bills, and how folks can frame those in ways that make sense in service to the intelligence community, to nonprofits, and into the government and many other different paths. So this is just the beginning of what we know is an exciting relationship with all of you. Thank you for completing that poll, and thank you in particular to all of our amazing alumni speakers and Elise for spearheading this conversation. I've already gotten a number of emails from you saying how great it was, and I couldn't agree more. Thank you all so much. We will see you tomorrow. Thank you. All right. I think if everyone has had a chance to vote, can vote, or who's still with us has a chance to vote. Otherwise, I will close out the poll.
Okay.
All right.
I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
I have a 5 o'clock student, so I'm going to head out.
All right. Thank you, Elise. This is great.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.